Hello and welcome to pmclounge.com. In this video, we are going over the Scrum artifacts. And basically, there are three artifacts: product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. As always, if you're into reading articles, if you would rather read about this topic than watch a video, then check out the first link in the description below. It will take you to an article on this topic over at our official website, pmclounge.com. Also, second link is going to be a list of all the videos, all the agile related videos that we have done on this channel. So do check those two links out. Important. Let's move on. A quick reminder, please like this video. That seems to be the only way YouTube is going to let you know every time we upload new content. All right, now artifacts are basically store of information. This is where information is stored. And you need information because software projects run on information. And that's where artifacts come into play. That's why artifacts are important. Now, you might think we are talking about Scrum, which is agile, which means documentation isn't that important because working software is valued more than comprehensive documentation. And that's a fact, that's true. But at the same time, documentation is also important. You see, documentation will tell you what you set out to achieve, right? Halfway through the project, you should not forget what you actually set out to achieve. And those who don't know where they are going, they don't reach there because they didn't knew where they are going to begin with. So the three artifacts that Scrum teams use are product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. And these need not be heavy 200-page Word documents. What they are is something that we will look in the coming slides. So let's start off with product backlog. The simplest way to understand product backlog is that it is a list of everything needed in the product, not the project, the product. Everything that you need in the product is listed in the product backlog. Now you might wonder, well, you are just doing the 1.0 release right now. That means there are certain requirements, certain features that you are delivering in 1.0. It is possible that some of them you were not able to deliver. So those are the ones that are in the product backlog. Is that correct? Well, that's partially correct. When you deliver 1.0, there would be certain features that you were not able to deliver. They are anyways part of the product backlog, but you will also get feedback from your customers. They might request for new features. They also get added in the product backlog. In the same time, your product owner might be looking at your competition, and the product owner realizes that there are certain features that the competition has which we don't, so they will also be entered into your product backlog. So essentially what happens is product backlog never gets completed. Your product backlog is an ongoing list which contains all the features that the product should have. Now, I've also done a video where we differentiated between product backlog and sprint backlog. I'll share a link to it, the third link in the description below. You can check that out. And that's where I used an example of Microsoft Windows. I don't want to repeat the entire example here, but the fact is Microsoft Windows 10 was supposed to be the last major release from Microsoft, but they are now coming up with Microsoft 11 because they understand the fact that product backlog is never complete. There will always be features, and it is possible that there are huge features, large features that do not fit in minor releases, and they need to bump up the version to Windows 11 itself. Now, product backlog can be managed via simple spreadsheets or some database. It can also be managed via software like Jira. So that's how product backlog is managed. The product owner is the person who is responsible for refining the product backlog, staying up to date on company or market needs. So whatever the company needs or whatever the market needs, the product owner needs to ensure that all those requirements, all those feature requests are part of the product backlog. And the product owner is also responsible for adding, removing, or reordering backlog items. Now, what is this reordering backlog items? So let's say there's a list of 10 features and your team can only deliver 6. So the team is going to come to the product owner and ask which 6 out of these 10 should we deliver in our next iteration. And this ordering is something that the product owner needs to do. The product owner needs to tell the team that these are the 6 that you should work on because they are high priority items. So that's also something that the product owner is responsible for. Okay, so let's take a look at the components of the product backlog. What are the components of a product backlog? What does a product backlog look like? Now, this is how a product backlog is going to look like. You have 3 requirements here, although you will never find a product backlog that has just 3 requirements. But let's assume, for the sake of example, that this is how a product backlog looks like, and there are 3 requirements here. So there are 4 components of each requirement that you will always find. Number one is the order or the priority of the requirement. This is where the example that we discussed in the previous slide comes into play, where we said that we can only deliver 6 items and the product owner told us which 6 items to work on. So similarly, uh, product owner basically enters an order or a priority for each of the requirements. So let's say this is the most important requirement, product owner is going to give it order 1. Then there is a description. What is this requirement all about? Let's say we are creating Facebook. Some iteration of Facebook is already live, and right now Facebook does not have the capability to allow friends to comment on others' photos and posts in general, right? So this requirement is basically about allowing someone's friends to comment on posts and photos and videos of others, right? So that is the description of this requirement. Then there is an estimate. This is something engineering is going to provide, of course, in tandem with the product manager and other stakeholders as well, product owner and other stakeholders as well. And this could be in man hours, person hours. This could be in terms of just the hours. This could be in terms of dollars as well. But there is a certain estimate that is associated with each requirement. So let's say allowing friends to comment on posts, this is something that would require 100,000 US dollars. So that's the estimate for this requirement which will be added. Next is the value. What is the value that this requirement is going to provide? And since this is priority number 1, this is order number 1, this better have very high value, and it surely does. It basically allows friends to make comments on others posts, other friends posts, and this is going to increase the engagement. This is going to increase the amount of time people spend on Facebook. So that's the value that this requirement provides. So that's how each requirement has 4 components, and all these 4 components help the product owner and other stakeholders to take a decision on which requirements should be prioritized and which ones they need to work on. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, product backlog is never complete. Although we just see 3 requirements here, product backlog is never complete and will usually have hundreds, if not thousands, of requirements. A quick reminder, if you're looking for book recommendations for your PMP exam preparation, head over to pmclounge.com/resources. We always keep this page up to date. Sprint backlog. So a list of everything to be built during the sprint is what a sprint backlog really is. Product backlog was everything that is needed in the product, but now we are down to a sprint. And if you don't know what a sprint really is, I'll share a link. The fourth one in the description will be a video of Scrum 101. Check that out if you don't know what a sprint really is. So everything that needs to be built during the sprint, that is part of the sprint backlog. Sprint backlog is created during the sprint planning session. So there is a sprint planning session that needs to be performed by, and everyone in the team needs to basically contribute and participate in the sprint planning session. That's where sprint backlog is created. Note that sprint backlog can evolve based on what the team learns during the course of the sprint. So a lot of people tend to think that once a sprint backlog is finalized, once items from the product backlog come into the sprint backlog, they think that okay, we have to deliver these items in this sprint, but that's not mandatory. Sprint backlog can also evolve, it can also change based on whatever that team learns during the course of the sprint itself. And that's the beauty of Scrum, right? That's the beauty of Agile, because you are Agile, you can make changes even if it's late during the project cycle, right? So you are always welcoming of changes. And if the team finds something new during the course of the sprint backlog can still change. Okay, so let's look at the components of the sprint backlog. We looked at the components of the product backlog. Now let's talk about the components of the sprint backlog. Number one is sprint goal. What is the goal of your sprint? So the Scrum team, they come up with a sprint goal or the objective of the sprint, right? So why are we doing this sprint? There has to be an objective of the sprint. And this goal or objective can be met once the team completes the sprint items. So whatever items in the sprint backlog, once they are complete, the objective or the goal of the sprint is met. Let's say the goal of the sprint is to ensure that we deliver, the first item from the product backlog, which is going to increase the amount of time people spend on Facebook, right? So that's the goal of your sprint. Next is sprint items. Sprint items are decided in the first part of the sprint planning session. So when you're doing the sprint planning session, the first part of that session is dedicated to deciding the sprint items. This is where the team decides what can be achieved in the sprint. So what items from the product backlog can be moved to the sprint backlog, they will be known as sprint items. And whatever that the team feels like can be achieved as part of one sprint, it basically moves from product backlog to sprint backlog, and they are then known as sprint items. So we talked about how in the first part of the sprint planning session, sprint items are decided. And now in the second part of the sprint planning session, this is where the team determines how the selected items that they have selected are going to get done. And they decided by further decomposing these items into tasks. This is your sprint plan. Decomposing the items selected from the product backlog to be moved to the sprint backlog, decomposing those items into tasks. Because the item was, in our previous example, the item was the ability to allow friends to make comments on posts. But that's a big item, right? You need to basically uh, divide it or decompose it into tasks, and you're going to make this decomposition while doing your sprint planning session in the second half of your sprint planning session. Now, does this ring a bell? If you have studied work breakdown structure, this decomposition part is going to basically remind you of the work breakdown structure. But here we are talking about Agile. We are not doing about traditional project management here. So you don't create the entire WBS here. What you're working on is based on the order of the requirements, right? You are going to basically decompose only the items that you will first build. So requirement number one will get decomposed first, and then you will start building that requirement. In the meantime, you will also basically go along the way and decompose other items as well. So you don't wait till the last item in your sprint backlog is decomposed and then you will start working. That's not something that is going to happen. You will decompose the first items, the highest priority items, and you will start working on them at the same time continuing the process of decomposition. Also, if you are interested in work breakdown structure, I'll drop a link in the description below, the fifth one, which is going to be a playlist of the work breakdown structure. Finally, let's talk about the last artifact, the last Scrum artifact, which is increment. Now, Scrum is incremental. This is a term, incremental. So Scrum is basically incremental, which means that the project is broken down into chunks, and each of these chunks are delivered one after the other. So you break down the project into chunks and you deliver these chunks. Each of these chunks is thus an increment. So you're basically delivering chunks one after the other. Each chunk is an increment. Note that an increment is a working software. It is a shippable product. This is something that you might have heard, that at the end of each sprint, the team produces a shippable product or a working software. And this working software is demonstrated to the user in the sprint review. So there is a sprint review session that is basically arranged, and that's where you are demonstrating the working software to the users. It also includes items previously delivered during previous sprints. So when you're adding the functionality of allowing friends to make comments on their friends' posts, you are not going to delete the previous functionalities, right? The previous chunks that you have delivered, which is, let's say, creating a profile, adding someone as a friend. All those functionalities remain there as it is. When you're basically demonstrating what you have done in this sprint, all the previous functionalities stay intact, and your focus is on whatever that you have developed in this sprint. So a product increment is the sum of all the backlog items that are completed during the ongoing sprint, the present one, and all of the previous sprints as well, right? So all of the previous sprints means functionalities like adding a friend, creating a profile, all of that remain as it is. And during this sprint where you have added the functionality of allowing people to comment on their friends' posts, this is all of this combined makes up the product increment. So I hope you understand what an increment really is. And that's all that we needed to talk about when it comes to Scrum artifacts. I hope you got value out of this video. Smash that like button if you did. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Very, very important. And also don't forget to check out the website pmclounge.com, your number one free PMP resource. Thank you and have a nice day.